annual CrimeSTAT Briefing. I'm Norm Becker, board of the Chamber of Commerce, and we're so happy to have everybody in person and then also so happy to have the virtual audience as well who are joining us. So we're here to talk about public safety and crime reduction. Why? Well, for one thing, it's all around us and we know that, and our neighbors know that, but also because our economic future depends in a large part on our ability to make Albuquerque and New Mexico a safe place, an exciting place to work, to live, grow a business, and raise a family. We know our residents care about crime. They see and feel the impact of it every single day. And they're asking for a justice system to change, to be better, be tougher. And we know that businesses are affected by crime in ways that raise our costs and impact our growth plans. That's why crime reduction is one of the top 3 priorities for the Chamber of Commerce. In just a few minutes, we'll be hearing from our District Attorney, Raúl Torrez, about the latest crime trends in the community and the crime fighting programs, technologies, and policies he's pursuing, which we are very much in support of. But before we do that, however, we're going to provide a short briefing of the Chamber's public safety priorities and work, and also want to recognize our sponsors today for the luncheon and some special guests that are with us here today. To that end, I'd like to start by introducing Julie Morgus-Buck, our county manager. She is here, so good to see you again, Julie. University of New Mexico President Garnett Stokes, we're so happy to have you with us also. City Councilor Brooke Bassan is here. Brooke, City Councilor, nice to see you. Former Higher Education Cabinet Secretary Barbara Dameron is here. Barbara, nice to see you. Our buddy UNM Athletic Director Eddie Nunez is here with us. Eddie. And I think I just saw the Albuquerque Police Department Chief Harold Medina. Harold, did I see you walk by? There you are. You thought he was heading for the stage, didn't you? That's after the event, right? And we have a soon-to-be school board member with us today. She won her race last week in a convincing fashion for the West Side District 5 on the APS board. Small businesswoman and early childhood education leader, Crystal Tapia Romero is here. Let's welcome her and congratulate her. We had a meeting with her last week and it was so nice to hear a school board member talk about the kids. And that's what her theme was, kids. And of course, I want to introduce my colleague, Chamber President and CEO, Terri Cole, our public safety big chairperson, Paul DePaula from US Bank, and public safety big chair, Meg Meister of Module Sperling. Thank you all. And now to recognize and thank some of the great companies and organizations who are sponsoring today's annual CrimeSTAT briefing. I'll read through them quickly and then we'll applaud for them at the end if you don't mind. P&M Resources and Senior Vice President, CFO Don Terri, New Mexico Mutual President Kelly Mixon, University of New Mexico and its President Garnett Stokes, including UNM Health Sciences Center, UNM Health, UNM Comprehensive Cancer Center, UNM Athletics, and UNM Rainforest Innovations. Western Sky Community Care Vice President Quinn Lopez, Comcast Vice President Chris Duncanson, Bank of Albuquerque, New Mexico CEO Jennifer Thomas and Senior Vice President Kyle Beasley, US Bank and US Bank Regional President Paul DePaula, Unirac CEO Peter Lorenz, French Funerals and Cremation President and CEO Tom Antrim, Albertson's Regional Vice President Travis Cheney, Verizon is a sponsor, Fidelity Investments Vice President Public Affairs Leanne Kravitz, Molson Corbin President and CEO Kevin Eads, Nusenda President and CEO Joe Christian, Ultra Health and CEO and President Duke Rodriguez, General Mills Plant Manager Isabella Capones, Payday HCM President Mike Stanford, James President and COO Shad James, Sandia Laboratory Federal Credit Union Executive Vice President and COO Robert Chavez, KOB Vice President, General Manager Michelle Donaldson, Geltmore LLC, Manager and CEO Paul Silverman, and Loveless Biomedical President CEO Bob Rubin. Thank you for these great contributors and for their engagement and their generosity. We appreciate you. Let's please acknowledge them. That's a long, impressive list, I know, but it's a formidable list. And to me, what is so important about that list and other lists of other sponsored events is that our business community is getting behind our Chamber of Commerce to do the great work that the Chamber of Commerce does. So thank you all very much, and we sure appreciate you. All right, now let's turn it over to Paul DiPaolo to get us started. Paul?
Thank you, Norm. The Chamber and the Public Safety team is on a crime reduction mission. And we've actually been on that mission for a couple of years, and now you start to hear some things mentioned in campaigns or legislative agenda discussion. And I think some other people are starting to hear our cry and are on board. We need to further reduce property crime. We're on the heels of our 100th homicide of the year, a staggering record. It's clear that gun violence, violent crime in general, is simply out of control. Swift crime accountability is the deterrent, and those who commit crimes in Albuquerque must face swift and certain apprehension and punishment. They must believe that they will be caught. They must believe that they will be prosecuted, and they must believe that they will be convicted. And they have to believe it will all happen in a matter of months and not 2 years or longer. The bottom line is we need to be a more uncomfortable place to commit crimes. That means we need to have a more strategic, sophisticated, and tougher justice system. We'll be involved in a lot of public safety efforts and initiatives this year, but I want to mention, as Norm had mentioned, the most important three today. Number one is the pretrial detention of serious offenders. Just last month, Norm, Terri, and I wrote a journal op-ed piece that brought a few hard and harsh realities to our community's attention. And according to that data, and what I'm speaking about, what you've heard about is the revolving door. Let me give you 3 pieces of information. Number one, twice each day, a defendant who has been released pre-trial is arrested for committing a new crime in Bernalillo County. Number two, every other day, a released defendant is arrested for committing a violent crime in our community. And third, and just every couple of months, every 2 months, a defendant that we had in custody and we chose to release is arrested for committing a first-degree felony, the most awful of crimes like murder and rape. It's no wonder this is happening. Our judiciary only grants half of the motions to our DA, and that our DA makes to detain those serious offenders. The rest are released, and as we learned from recent media reports, like in KOB and others, even those that are required to wear the ankle monitor haven't actually been monitored in real time. For several years now, we've been calling for change, for judges to use that authority, the authority that we, the voters, have given them to detain offenders more often, and for our laws to change to presume that those who are arrested for serious and violent crimes are a danger enough to be held in jail pre-trial. Presuming the detention of dangerous offenders will be in the front of the legislature this year. The DA has long supported it, and we are happy to see the governor now calling for this type of change as well. It needs to be real. It needs to have teeth, and we'll be working to make that happen. Number two initiative, in the next few months, be on the lookout for Case Catcher, a new technology that the Chamber is developing as part of our DOJ grant, and that will revolutionize how crime cases are prepared, referred, and to prosecutors and launched. Top prosecutors say 50% of their time in court is spent arguing about discovery or evidence, and discovery issues derail and delay cases far too often. Case Catcher will attack this problem, will allow law enforcement to refer to cases to the DA electronically, guide them in the process of compelling discovery based on the charges, create cases that are more complete when they're launched, and meticulously track discovery that is shared with the defense. Stronger cases from the word go will mean more convictions, earlier plea deals, as well as fewer dismissals and delays. Case Catcher will absolutely mean swifter and more certain justice. We're the only chamber in the nation that had received such a crime-fighting grant from the DOJ, and it's going to make a difference. Third, and finally, we need more officers on our streets, faster response times, and more investigations. We will aggressively support recruitment and retention stipends at the local and the state level, as well as push for more local and federal crime-fighting partnerships. And we need to be sure that there is in fact a light at the end of the tunnel for the DOJ settlement and agreement with APD with reachable and reasonable policies and benchmarks that our officers can meet. All of this work aligns with our past and current efforts to launch the Crime Strategies Unit, to deploy license plate readers across to catch thieves, to increase penalties of gun crimes and other types of serious crime. This is important work, and it's the challenge of our time in our community. We have to have a greater Albuquerque. We need a safer Albuquerque, and we as the chamber intend to make that happen. Thank you. Back to you, Norm.
Okay. We've been so fortunate to have you at the helm of our public safety work, Paul. And I'll tell you what, that case catcher that you talked about, that's going to be game for our communities. It's pretty exciting stuff. So it's fantastic that our chamber is able to spearhead a major project like that. All right, to introduce our featured speaker today, we have Kelly Mixon with us, President and CEO of New Mexico Mutual. Kelly's Chamber's treasurer and has 28 years experience of public accounting and private accounting. She's also named a 2019 Women of Influence by Albuquerque Business First. We're happy to have her on our chamber board. Please join me in welcoming Kelly to the podium.
Thank you, Norm. I'm honored today to introduce our speaker, District Attorney Raúl Torrez. DA Torrez's fourth CrimeSTAT briefing for us here at the chamber, and we're grateful to have him. DA Torrez is a former federal prosecutor. He was sworn in as Bernalillo County DA on January 1st, 2017, and has previously served as an assistant U.S. attorney, assistant attorney general, and assistant. Born and raised here in Albuquerque, DA Torrez was appointed by President Obama in 2009 to serve as White House Fellow and Special Counsel to the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. I don't know how he got that all on his business card, but it's impressive. He's a graduate of Harvard University, earned a master's degree from London School of Economics, and earned his law degree from Stanford. Very impressive background. Please join me in welcoming DA Torrez to the stage.
So it's a very special privilege to be back once again with the Greater Albuquerque Chamber of Commerce. Of all of the relationships and partnerships we've been able to form over the last several years in terms of building a district attorney's office that really tries to understand and respond to the community, we haven't had a greater partner than the chamber. And so I just want to thank Terri, and I want to thank the chamber for always being behind us and always supporting us. It is not always an easy thing. I have a tendency sometimes to go to Santa Fe or other places where policy is being formulated. and doing what I can to speak difficult truths sometimes about the nature of our challenges in the criminal justice system. So I just want to thank Terri for that. Thank you very much. The other thing I want to do at the outset is recognize Sherman McCorkle. For those of you who don't know Sherman, if you're in this room, I would be surprised if you don't, because he always offers little bits of wisdom. And one of the things he reminded me on my way up to speak today is to acknowledge that this is the 246th birthday of the United States Marine Corps. So thank you very much, Sherman, for extending that. And for those of you who probably don't know as much about my family, there's a lieutenant colonel who's now a commanding officer of the Marine battalion in 29 Palms named Jason Copeland. That's my first cousin, and he is far and away the most popular public servant in my family. So I just want to extend my thanks to him for his service. I also want to take a moment to recognize and extend my appreciation to Chief Medina and the Albuquerque Police Department. We had an incredible victory yesterday. We secured a first-degree murder conviction in a murder case that rocked this community. A young man, Jackson Weller, who was a young UNM baseball player, was killed in Nob Hill a little over 2 years ago. And it was a moment that I think galvanized everyone's sense of vulnerability and really started getting people to focus on a lot of the underlying issues, including pretrial detention, which I'm going to focus on today. So what I'd like to do is really just dive in to that issue and then hold for the Q&A questions that you may have, and you probably do have, about the current trend lines with violent crime, property crime, and those other things. But in terms of making the most out of our time here today, I think it's important for us to focus first and foremost on what I consider to be one of the most serious public safety issues that we confront as a community, as a state, give you a sense of where I think this policy got off track, and more importantly, how I think we can correct something that has consequences for the lives and public safety of everyone in this room and everyone in this community. So we should start, as we always do, in the beginning, and that is with the actual ballot initiative question that was presented to the voters in the state of New Mexico back in 2016. And I purposely put this language at the beginning of this presentation because I think it's important for us to understand what our intentions were when we adopted bail reform. And when you look at that language, it says pretty clearly we were going to amend the New Mexico Constitution to protect community safety by granting courts new authority to deny release on bail pending trial for dangerous defendants in felony cases, while retaining the right to pretrial release for non-dangerous defendants who do not pose a flight risk. It is little wonder when you look at how that constitutional question was presented to voters. It's not surprising that it had overwhelming support. 87% of the citizens of this state who voted on that particular question supported that initiative. And I think pretty clearly there was a sense that proposal aligned with where we are as a community. We wanted the ability to keep violent, dangerous people behind bars, and yet the ability to take not violent, often suffering from a substance abuse issue, and get them out of custody so that they could be effectively and safely supervised. And so there were two primary elements that were presented to the voting public. And unfortunately, I don't think we've kept faith with that basic promise, that basic proposition. And I think a lot of that has to do with the structure. The amendment itself was developed, how it came out of the legislature, and then ultimately how it was implemented specifically in Bernalillo County. So bear with me, this is very detailed, but I think critically important. Everywhere in this country where there is a framework, either in federal court or various state jurisdictions, there are three basic ways you can detain a defendant. Number one, that defendant has either in their current case or in their criminal history some evidence of a violent tendency. They are inherently dangerous. Number two, they have a history, if not of violence, of being called upon to show up at court, and for one reason or another, they can't be counted upon to show up. So they have a failure to appear risk, meaning they don't show up and the judicial process stalls because they're not in court. The third element is an element that's based around obstruction of justice. Is this person somebody who's going to intimidate a witness, threaten a juror, or otherwise obstruct the criminal justice process? In the implementation and adoption of the constitutional language that we brought into being in 2016, and what we've done is given you the framework that's in New Jersey as compared to the state of New Mexico. You can see right off the bat that we allowed for one and only one basis to move for the detention of an individual in the state of New Mexico, and that's dangerousness. So flight risk by itself or some evidence of obstruction of justice is not specifically included in that list. And that has profound consequences for you as business leaders, because oftentimes we are asked why we have not moved to detain someone who has a lengthy property crime history or history of offenses that are committed against businesses and a long history of not showing up to court. Given the structure of this constitutional amendment, we're not permitted to make an argument for detention unless we can make an argument for dangerousness. And what is critically important for you to understand is the language of the constitutional amendment was not on the ballot. That may sound like a minor detail, but for those of you in the media who are joining us today, it's critically important in the future when we are considering a constitutional amendment that we actually look at the language of the amendment itself and that language is presented to the voting public, because there is always, or has been at least in this instance, a misalignment between the stated intention and what voters think they're getting and what will actually result. So that structural infirmity in the construction of our constitutional amendment was then compounded in Bernalillo County by a process that very few people have taken the time to understand. And that was the implementation of what's called the Arnold Risk Assessment Tool. It's a data validated tool that has been used in various jurisdictions across the country. And in those other jurisdictions, there is an instrument that is used that is then presented to district court judges. And in every single felony case, when we move for detention, a judge has a copy of our motion and they have a copy of this instrument. And I will show you what real examples of what this instrument looks like. But in the implementation of that instrument and how it is used, there's a whole supplementary framework. And if you look at New Jersey or Arizona or California, they supplement that tool with a list of questions, really shocking things like, is this a crime of violence? Was a gun involved? Things like that. And that will assist and guide and hopefully come to a better outcome in the development of the recommendation that comes out of that risk assessment tool. If you look in New Mexico, every single question that was proposed in the development of the Arnold implementation tool was rejected by the team that was responsible for implementing it. Meaning we are using a tool that is built for other jurisdictions where you are allowed to move to detain people because of the failure to appear or for obstruction of justice. And we are also using an incomplete tool because we didn't adopt any of this supplementary framework. Why does that matter? Well, the best way to understand it is to look at some very clear examples. And these were taken at random, but this is an example of the kinds of things that we see every single day inside the criminal justice system. This is Daniel Espinosa. Mr. Espinosa came in for possession of a controlled substance, possession of drug paraphernalia. He had no violent felonies and property and misdemeanor cases only. What is interesting about Mr. Espinosa, and think back to that constitutional question, right? About the ability to take nonviolent people with substance abuse issues and get them out into supervision. The Arnold Risk Assessment Tool, using factors that are applied and used in other jurisdictions, but not tailored for New Mexico, actually looks at his extensive history as a property offender and awards him 6 out of 6 points. And if you look here, it recommends that Mr. Espinosa be detained. Again, somebody with no violent history, somebody with a substance abuse issue, and likely somebody who can be effectively supervised if there are adequate resources and there is wraparound services, if there are substance abuse treatment available for Mr. Espinosa. This is somebody that we can potentially release into the community and manage effectively. We did not move to detain him, but the instrument that the court relies on did. That's problematic but not nearly as problematic as this example. And note that I'm using a different defendant from the exact same day using the exact same tool. This is Anthony Gallegos, who was charged with aggravated battery on a household member, aggravated assault, abandonment of a child. He punched his girlfriend more than 100 times. He slammed her head into a concrete floor, strangled her, and threatened her with a gun. Mr. Gallegos has no long, extensive criminal history. He is not someone who is addicted to drugs. He has a domestic violence history. He is somebody who, by the nature of his offenses, we believe should be detained. And yet look at the tool and what it recommends for dealing with Mr. Gallegos. Mr. Gallegos, it recommends that he be released. So the instrument that the court is using is telling the judge, hold this low-level nonviolent drug addict in jail and let Mr. Gallegos go. My office, not surprisingly, reaches the opposite conclusion many times. And many times we end up not filing on cases that the tool is telling us to file on, or more often, filing on somebody like Mr. Gallegos, who the court, in its judgment, relying on this instrument, has reached a different conclusion. When we look back at all of the individuals that we have moved to detain from the beginning of that tool in January 2017 through September, 70% of the individuals that we have moved to detain are in on a current crime of violence, and those that are in blue represented in this graphic, property crimes, drug offenses, things like that, there is oftentimes some history of violence or weapons in their recent past, and that's why we made the determination. What's interesting, and though not surprising about that, is there's a logic in obviously focusing on violent offenders, because even though violent offenders tend to be a relatively small component of overall crime, they also tend to be overwhelmingly violent when they come back into the system. There is a propensity for that second offense to involve violence and often guns and firearms. In fact, they're 3 times more violent than the rest of the criminal population in terms of making this decision. So what is interesting about the tool that we are relying on in the judiciary is if you look at the composition of when we move to file and when the court is told to detain somebody, they're vastly different. Our office, as I said before, overwhelmingly files in violent crime cases, only 13% for drugs, only 16% for property offenses. But look at the PSA recommendations. Their composition of people that they move to detain are individuals who are only 26% violent, and yet their drug composition is 32% and their property composition is 37%. Something is out of whack. Something isn't making sense. And I think fundamentally, we're going to have to step back from how this tool was implemented and try to see if we can align our intentions with what's actually happening on the streets. Because what we're seeing is this. We have, when you compare our FTA rates, those are the failure to appear in court rates, as compared to other jurisdictions who have engaged in bail reform, we perform at a much lower level. We have many more defendants not showing up to court. And for those of you who may have heard that our office moves to detain too many defendants, you should know that right now our effective rate of detention is around 14 or 15% of all referred felonies. We would likely move on a higher percentage if we had the legal authority and the ability to do it and a greater level of success, but we simply don't. But one thing that is obviously not true is that we are overusing this authority. What you will also see, and this is something that is, I think, contributing substantially to our violent crime and public safety crisis right now, is the rate at which these individuals who are out on release are committing new offenses. And that's what this is. This is comparing safety rates across jurisdictions. And you can see that Albuquerque and Bernalillo County is vastly underperforming our peers who have engaged in similar reforms. Paul mentioned this earlier when he gave us the introduction, but it's worth noting that we are still at about 50% success in terms of granted detentions that we file on these individuals. And one of the most shocking stats that we found is that the presence of a firearm actually lowers the rate at which we are successfully detaining people. Let me say that again. The presence of a firearm statistically lowers the rate of detention for individuals that we move to detain. So we actually broke out types of crime when there was a violent offender and someone who was using a gun versus somebody who did not have a gun. And in every single crime category, violent, property, drugs, and general public safety, we have greater success when there is no firearm present. That defies common sense. That defies basic logic. And when I'm asked about this, I can offer no explanation other than the fact that this system was built and constructed by a team full of lawyers, which seems to lead to a conclusion that we can somehow avoid the math. And I think that's a fundamental issue that we're going to have to get our hands around. So what do? There are a couple of strategies that we engage in the district attorney's office. I have perhaps the most robust partnership with my former colleagues at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And the reason for that is not only do we get more severe sentencing on the back end, but we get more certainty in detention on the front end. And the way to really understand this is there are 202 individuals that we have referred into federal prosecution that we have first filed to detain in state court, because a lot of times the feds have not adopted our case referral before we can actually make a decision about detention or release. And look what happens. I am only successful at detaining those individuals 62% of the time. And yet, when you walk across the street, when you walk to the north side of Lomas, the detention rate jumps to 91% on the same defendants, with the same criminal history, with the same criminal conduct. That is a vast disparity, but a clear illustration of how two different systems work. And the most important distinction between those systems is what is called a rebuttable presumption of detention, which I'll talk to you about in a little bit. In the federal system, if you show up with a crime of violence or a drug trafficking crime and you have a firearm, you better call your parents, you better call your family, because you are not getting out. And the same cannot be said for state court. Unfortunately, the United States Attorney's Office is a relatively small operation by comparison, and Chief Medina and I cannot possibly resolve all of the gun-related cases that we have by moving them into federal court. In fact, recent conversations with my peers at DOJ revolved around an audit that was done by the Department of Justice, and their question from DC was why this particular office was adopting so many firearm-related cases, which are typically handled by the local prosecutor. And the answer given by the interim U.S. attorney is simple. The state system is not adequately detaining the most violent and dangerous people. This is a pre-COVID, pre-pandemic snapshot. This is not the entire universe of individuals who we have moved to detain. This says 1,500. It's actually now about 2,600 individuals we moved to detain. Take a look at their collective criminal history, because these are the individuals who have been released. Collectively, they have 2,400 violent felonies, but between them, 532 aggravated assaults, 135 armed robberies, 101 sexual assaults and rapes, and 49 murders. That's the 10-year criminal history of the 1,500 defendants who have been released from custody. The most prominent and frankly tragic example that we have comes in the form of Devin Mumford. Mr. Mumford was somebody who had trafficking amounts of fentanyl in his car. He also had a loaded .45 and decided it would be a good idea to shoot that gun off in city limits. He was arrested by APD. He was referred for prosecution to my office, and we moved for his detention. The detention ruling in that case found that, yes, we believe Devin Mumford is a danger to the community, but no, we disagree that there are no conditions that can be fashioned to keep all of you safe. And what were those conditions? GPS monitoring. What we believed, and I think what the court believed to be 24/7 GPS monitoring. And in fact, Devin Mumford was wearing his GPS ankle monitor when in April of 2021, he actually went and committed a homicide while wearing that GPS monitor. He then cut it off and went on that same weekend to brandish a shotgun at an elderly woman in this community, and then finished it off with an armed robbery in the Southeast. He, unfortunately, is not the only example. Darian Bashir, who we convicted yesterday, is someone who just weeks prior to the homicide of Jackson Weller was arrested for shooting a rifle in the city at members of the Albuquerque Police Department. He was not detained. And just to drive the point home, Devin Mumford and that Arnold risk assessment tool, this is the Arnold risk assessment tool for Devin Mumford after he committed a murder the second time we tried to detain him. It recommends his pretrial release, finding yet again that there could be conditions that could be crafted to preserve and protect the community. This is a stark example, but far from the only example. This is Paul Apodaca. Mr. Apodaca has recently confessed to not one, not two, but 3 unsolved cold case murders from the 1980s. His recommendation from the risk assessment tool is that he be released back into the community. In short, we have, I think, a dramatic misalignment between intentions and what the community believed it was getting when it voted for this important reform, and what is actually happening on the ground. Now, much has been made, and there have been studies produced by the Administrative Office of the Courts in an attempt to make the case that this system is working very well. And they rely on that analysis by saying that fewer than 1% of those individuals who've been picked up for new offenses has been charged with a first-degree felony. Let me tell you, as somebody who spends every day, all day long working in this world, the incidence of first-degree felonies is already extraordinarily rare, like a shooting star. So telling us that something that rarely occurs is also rarely occurring in this universe doesn't tell you much of anything. But more importantly and more troublingly is the assertion that only 5% of the individuals who've been arrested have been arrested on new violent offenses and therefore are not committing new crimes. As any criminologist knows, as the chief of police knows, as all law enforcement professionals know, relying on that statistic to make a claim that the system is working hides an important, very important truth. The first is that in most cases and most crimes often go unreported. Property offenses and violent crime offenses go unreported. And so if you are relying on arrests to make the claim that there is no new offense, you're missing the bigger picture. But even if you rely on that, these are national statistics. These are not Albuquerque statistics. And I wouldn't claim that this is what the Albuquerque Police Department or the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office or state police is going through. But these are BJA statistics about the clearance rate, meaning how many times someone is arrested and charged for a particular category of crime. The clearance rate for property crimes is 17%. The clearance rate for violent crimes is only 45%. So there is a vast universe of either unreported or uncleared violent crimes occurring in this community. The court would have you believe that because individuals in our universe haven't been arrested for those crimes, that they're not responsible for them, but that's not a claim that any credible criminologist or statistician can reasonably make. We have to move beyond this. We have to acknowledge that the system is broken and start focusing on real solutions. Fortunately, the citizens of this community resoundingly support strengthening pretrial release provisions. 77% support strengthening those provisions to keep violent, dangerous defendants behind bars. Only 11% oppose them. And by the way, this cuts across policy, politics, ideology, demographics, across the board. Folks with postgraduate education, folks that just graduated from high school, folks that are very liberal, folks that are very conservative. How often do you hear in this country that kind of consensus? It's very rare. And it happens only when people clearly understand that there's a problem that needs to be fixed. And so what is the solution? It's actually relatively straightforward. It's framed off of the 1984 Bail Reform Act, which has been in place for nearly 40 years. It's something that federal prosecutors that I use on a daily basis In detention hearings, by the way, that would take anywhere from 8 to 15 minutes, while my detention hearings routinely last 30, 40, 50 minutes, an hour, or 2 hours, only to have half of them tossed out. Rebuttable presumption of detention would apply to the following cases: murder, voluntary manslaughter, aggravated battery, sexual exploitation of children, aggravated criminal sexual penetration, robbery in the first or second degree, human trafficking. When a defendant brandished or discharged a firearm during the commission of a charged felony offense, and when the defendant inflicted great bodily harm or caused the death of a person during the commission of a charged felony. And anyone who had been convicted of any one of those in the previous 5 years. Because I think there is a pretty widely held consensus that if you're convicted of something like this, and within 5 years' time, you're coming back in on a new felony, you're probably somebody that needs to remain behind bars. This is, in short, I think, the path towards realigning what is happening in the courtroom, what is happening in our community with the voters' intention when they pass this. And I want to make something abundantly clear to you, and I try to make this abundantly clear to citizens when I talk to them at community groups across the city. I have not been and have never been someone who has advocated for abolishing bail reform. It is absolutely true that in this jurisdiction 10 years ago and in other jurisdictions across the country, we would routinely see nonviolent, low-level people languishing in jail in ways that were detrimental not only to them, but detrimental to you as a community. It is not in their best interest, and it is not in your best interest to go back to an old system, which based whether you remained free or whether you got out of jail based on how much money you had in your bank account. That is not who we are. We need to have the courage to continue to try and do what is right by those individuals. And I do not advocate for throwing out the whole system and moving back to a system where low-level people would languish in jail for an extended period of time. That is not right either. What is also something that we can't avoid, however, is the idea that too many violent repeat offenders, specifically offenders with guns, are landing back out on the streets of this community and causing real serious harm. And we have to have the courage and the ability to take a step back, to acknowledge that we didn't get this policy right in the first instance, and then hopefully move forward from a policy perspective that brings balance to the system. I'm not sure where I am on time, but I'm happy to open it up now for further questions if that's something you'd like to do.
Are you hearing? Are you hearing me?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. So the trick is to flip that up correctly. So Raúl, thanks very much. You know, as always, you're just so impressive and so dang courageous. We have been working on this pretrial detention issue with Raúl now, what is it, 3 legislative sessions now? And it's very, very difficult and it takes a lot of courage, and you do such a fantastic job. I think with the governor's support this year, we've got a real shot at making it happen. You think? Well,
as somebody who has taken a few trips up to Santa Fe in the very strange round building, I never like to make any predictions, but I will say I think it's the best opportunity we've ever had to fix this system.
Yeah, I agree with you. So let's go to Q&A, and starting off our Q&A is our president of the University of New Mexico, President Garnet Stokes.
Thank you, Raúl. It's so good to see you, and great presentation. As you know, the University of New Mexico spans tremendous parts of the city of Albuquerque, and from south and central and north. We bring people in from all over the world to be here, to study, etc. And of course, what's happening here affects us every day. I'm wondering if you have thoughts about what we at UNM can do to improve the safety of our community and the perceptions of that safety. And what does a partnership, what can a partnership look like? How does UNM be part of the solution with the city, the county, the state? Thank you.
So thank you, President Stokes, for the question. And one thing that I will also note that, you know, I have this overly lengthy bio that I guess my staff sends to people, but the one thing that's missing there is I'm more often known as the Dean of Students' husband in certain circles. And so what's happening with the university? Thank you. I am acutely aware and hear both officially and unofficially about the need for us to try and do more and build a stronger partnership with the University of New Mexico. What I think UNM fundamentally can do is use and leverage its tremendous resources as a research center, as a multiple disciplinary source of real talent. You can bring together folks from the medical community, from criminal justice, and all the various institutions and colleges inside the university, and focus on what I think is the longest and most consequential long-term challenge facing our community and the criminal justice system. And that has nothing to do with this. And it has everything to do with adverse childhood experiences and ACEs. And for those of you who have attended my presentations in the past, one of the things I always like to highlight is the fact that what I'm talking about now is trying to bring a fire truck to an emergency situation. If you really want to build a safe community from the ground up, you have to, and we have to start paying long-term and making long-term investments in at-risk children, in children in this community who have routinely been neglected and who go through tremendous social harm. And it's not surprisingly that it's those individuals who end up in our system. And so if you can, Terry, would you ask them maybe to turn this back on? I want to show you.
Can you alternate? There you go.
what I'm
Where do you want
talking
it?
about. And this is the way, and this is the most important thing for us to think about as a community. It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. That defines the world that I live in every single day. There is rarely a criminal defendant that comes into my office that ends up looking at a substantial period of incarceration of the Department of Corrections, who comes to that point in their life having lived the kind of life that I had. Two stable, well, relatively stable parents, people who were focused on me, people who cared if I came home at night, people who took me to practice, who got me tutors, who helped me along the way, who were very much engaged in my life. The story of most of the people that we deal with is a story of early childhood trauma. And this is what we're talking about. 28% of the children in New Mexico have experienced 4 or more ACEs. 86% of the incarcerated juveniles have experienced 4 or more ACEs. What's an ACE? Sexual assault, physical abuse, neglect, living in the home of someone who is addicted to methamphetamine. And a lot of times that story of trauma starts with my office. I will incarcerate dad. Mom has a meth addiction. The child moves in with grandma or an aunt or somebody like that. He starts to struggle and fall behind. And pretty soon that young man, that young person tries to replace on the street the family that he doesn't have in his home. And that family needs him to earn his keep. So how does he earn a keep? Well, he starts selling drugs. And then he gets ripped off one time. And as Chief Medina knows, when you're selling drugs on the street and you get ripped off, you can't exactly call the cops. So what do? You pick up a gun to protect yourself. Then you become, you've dropped out of school, you've entered the adult system. I send you to prison, which is basically graduate school for criminals. And you're a traumatized young person with a raging addiction. No one is paying attention to your life. You do a short turn in that prison. You make a lot of new friends. You learn a lot of new skills. And what happens? They drop you on the street corner in Albuquerque and they say, okay, go back, figure out your life. That's a recipe for disaster. And this is what we're talking about. Prevention services, the rate of services and investment in at-risk children. Look at the national average, 25. Look at New Mexico, 1.7. The child victimization rate, astronomical. These are the ACEs scores for the kids in juvenile detention in Bernalillo County. 75% of the boys and 87% of the girls in detention reported exposure to 5 or more ACEs. If we don't get a handle on this, you will not live in a safe community. And a lot of times, Chief Medina and I, because we are the focal point in a moment of crisis, we're the ones that get asked, how do we fix this? How do we fix this? And you watch, if we drop the murder rate in a couple of years, the focus will move away from us, but it won't go to these kids. And that's where it needs to go. So the answer to your question is make the University of New Mexico the leading research institution in the country for identifying, tracking, and mitigating adverse childhood experiences. And if you do that, not only will you solve the public safety challenge 10, 15, and 20 years hence, but you will unlock the key to educational attainment, adverse healthcare outcomes, poorly trained workforces, economic vitality and opportunity. That is the key to solving all of these issues. And you have it in one building in one place. You have the medical professionals, you have the academics, you have the researchers, you have the partners, you have the ability to apply for federal grant money, prop up programs like the Adobe project, which we've talked about before, and make it a research institution. This is the core of New Mexico's long-term problems, not just public safety, is a whole generation of traumatized children.
Thank you. Let's let President Stokes know how we feel about that recommendation. Thank you, Raúl. Let's take a couple more questions. Yes, the gentleman far left. Sarah's going to get that mic to you here. There you go.
Thanks, Raúl, for the fantastic presentation. A couple of questions I have with the analysis that you've presented and what you spoke about UNM. The first part of the question is, when you come to a predictive analytics of sorts, where would you be able to focus your attention to prevent what you know is likely going to happen? And second, perhaps more important, is we've got a wide range of community leaders in this audience. What is your message for community engagement as a partnership to the public sector in order to meet the same, if not better, ways of managing our crime? Thanks.
Raúl, before you take that, can you tell us who you are for the benefit of the media covering you?
Thank you. My name is Alim Hashim. I'm here as a guest with Miles from NDI, and I have served with him for a bit. Professionally, we own early childhood education centers, having one opened 4 years ago and one opened last week on the west side.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So it's an excellent question. And if you look here, this is the most concrete sort of analytical framework to offer you. What you see on the left are those, again, coming from that same population of highly traumatized children. That is the rate of recidivism among children who go through the traditional criminal justice system, right? We charge them, they go through that system, they get sentenced to one degree or another, they're incarcerated for for a certain length of time, and then they're released without any substantial or sustained long-term intervention. What you see on the right is the recidivism rate for children that have gone through what's called the Adobe Program. Adobe is housed at the University of New Mexico, and it's a 2-generation outpatient model that basically what they do is they follow those kids after they leave the detention center. There's an education navigator, there's a healthcare and mental health navigator, there's substance abuse treatment. And by the way, if they go to the home and they identify that this children is suffering from a substance abuse disorder, And so is the mother. They enroll the mother. They enroll the caregiver. And they give extraordinary wraparound care and support, unfortunately, to a relatively small segment of the population that needs it. So in terms of dollars saved, lives saved, and crime prevented, if you took this and applied it to every detention center, youth and child detention center across this state, and did it at a sustained scale, you would have tremendous, not only savings and increases in public safety, but savings long-term in lower rates of incarceration, less need to keep hammering the police chief for more resources, because ultimately what you want us to do is you want us to fade into the background. You want to be going to chamber lunches where the DA is not giving an annual talk. If I'm coming back every year, something's wrong. And so what this needs to do is we need to talk about the immediate needs, the immediate changes that we have to have in the criminal justice system. But at the same time, and you as private sector leaders need to start making sustained commitments, because this is where politicians, elected leaders, and others have a real problem. To do this right, you can't do this for 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. You have to do this for 15 years or 20 years at scale. If you do that, if you make that investment, you will realize tremendous gains. And here's another piece of it, and this is why I like to involve our partners at Sandia National Lab, Mexico Tech. We have extraordinary data scientists in this community, people that do advanced analytics. I rely on people in a totally sort of nonprofit and free volunteer arrangement. I have data scientists from Sandia National Labs that come to the DA's office and code for us for free, in part because I shamed them by saying we still use WordPerfect. Wouldn't it be nice if there were some really bright people in this community that could help us build new tools? What if we got sustained engagement from all of these brilliant data scientists and data engineers, and we started breaking down the silos between data sets? Because I guarantee you that the data I see in the criminal justice system, there's a mirror of that data in the healthcare system. There's a mirror of that data in the education system. I can almost guarantee you that the truancy rate findings and the identification of those houses that have the highest rates of truancy, they line up with the same houses that have the highest rates of 911 ambulance callouts. They also have the same alignment with the number of 911 calls for the police. What if we brought all of that data together and shared it, not with law enforcement, but with a trained mental health professional or social worker or substance abuse counselor or somebody from Big Brothers Big Sisters? You would be shocked at how many of these kids, when they're asked, if you didn't come home tonight, would anyone know? 80, 90% of them say, yeah, no. There's no adult in my life that knows or cares if I come home. So things like NDI are incredibly important, and the work that you do is incredibly important, but there is so much untapped potential in this community. We just have to have the ability to engage in broad conversations and frankly, partner with the private sector, right? I encourage the newly elected members of the school board, who by the way, are the bravest politicians you will ever meet. Have the courage to start having conversations about data. What do we know? Who can we share it with? How can we leverage this? What can be done with it? Because you know who sees these kids first? People like my mom. My dad's a career prosecutor. My mom's a career teacher. And she was at Manzano High School, she could go through Manzano High School and say, that kid needs help. This kid needs help. This kid hasn't eaten. This kid's up all night, right? I guarantee you that when Chief Medina and I wake up every weekend and we find some new shooting, what do you think the correlation is between what our teachers are seeing in their classrooms and what our police are seeing on the weekend? There's massive overlap. And yet we exist in these siloed institutions where I have information and they have information and we never share that information. And much less do we deliver that information to somebody who can make a real world impact And the thing that I'm trying to get people to understand fundamentally is I don't want to do this as a means of saving this community or solving the public safety challenge. The challenge for you is to get my phone to stop ringing. The answer is not for me. It's not for him to arrest his way out of the problem or for me to prosecute our way out of the problem. The answer is for the phone to ring less. And we have to have the courage, all of us, whatever our political persuasion is, wherever seat we have in the private sector or the public sector, to just put it all on the table and come up with concrete solutions. If we can do that, you can build a safe community. Because I would love to turn into the Maytag man. And I just sit there and stare at the phone and wait for it to ring. Sadly, that's not what's going on. But we have all the pieces. We have the talent, we have the public sector engagement, we have the private sector engagement. We just have to have the ability to pull it all together.
Thank you, Raúl. I think that's called leadership. Okay, other questions? Peter.
I mean, this is, and you've brought a really important sort of moment for us to have a look at the big picture. And what I will do is move briefly through some of these statistics. This is property crime. And look, this is not something that I routinely put out to the public because it is not in alignment with what their lived reality is. Property crime is down. Property crime has been dropping for a very, very long time. Motor vehicle theft has been down for an extended period of time, with much credit due to the Albuquerque Police Department. This is violent crime. This is where we are from a violent crime perspective. This is aggravated assault. Now, people ask me about homicide, Peter, a lot. I always respond by telling them to tell me what the aggravated assault and aggravated battery numbers are. Because aggravated assault and aggravated battery, those are leading indicators, right? These are basically guys that were either brandishing a weapon or shooting at somebody, but they're bad shots, right? They can't hit their target. But the same people who are engaging in this activity, this is overwhelmingly where your homicides are coming from. And as you can see from this chart, there's nowhere near the sustained performance that we have seen in those other areas. And the reason for that is that we need to do more on data-informed and analytically informed precision enforcement and precision prosecution. There are probably 10 to 15 highly organized groups in this community who are driving an overwhelming share of the shots fired in this community. And because we don't have as much real-time data and intelligence on who they are and where they are, we are not able to get in front of the problem. We're always behind the problem. And that is, I think, a recognition of what we have asked the Albuquerque Police Department to do and others to do, short-staffed, with not enough resources, and frankly, far less in terms of the technical support than they really need. But if we can get ourselves focused on that, we will be able to get in front of the violent crime problem. But, you know, I don't want to speak to him. I try not to speak for him very often. What I can tell you that Chief Medina will often tell me, and someone in my position, is, where am I going to get? I would love to do that. Where do I get them? What part of the puzzle, what part of the equation would you like me to pull bodies from or resources from to tackle that? The governor has proposed adding additional officers statewide. I think that would be a tremendous help. What I think is missing from that equation is a recognition of the fact that public safety can no longer be the one area of our society that just doesn't use real-time data to drive decision-making. If we can do that and be more effective and more focused, you can get in front of the crime problem rather than trailing.
Thank you, Raul. Okay, other questions? We've got more time. Sherman. This is Sherman McCorkle. Oh, I also meant to mention Peter Lorenz is our incoming chair of the chamber starting July 1. He's president CEO with UNIRAC. So Peter, I wanted to make note of that. And Sherman, the floor is yours.
Are there other bills in this 30-day session that we could assist you in supporting?
So we actually sent up an entire legislative package up to the government. They have indicated a willingness to support not only our fixes for pretrial detention, but enhanced penalties for gun crimes. The chief and I have spoken at length at what we believe to be the inadequate penalties for gun violence in this community. So we've asked to mirror the federal statute. Whenever someone brandishes a gun, that increases the penalty. Whenever somebody discharges a gun, that increases the penalty. So it's not merely possession of a firearm, it's how that firearm is used in connection with a felony. We've asked for the elimination of the statute of limitations for second-degree murder. We have a number of unsolved cold case homicides that are well beyond the reasonable amount of time that it would be for us to prove premeditation, and we are barred by the statute of limitations from pursuing those charges. So we're asking for that. We're also asking for that penalty to be increased to 18 years that cannot be waived or in any way, washed away by the judiciary. You live in one of the only states in the country where if you were convicted of second-degree murder, the sentencing range is 0 to 15 years. 0. So we could convict you and you could face 0 years in prison for murder. That doesn't make any sense, and we're completely out of alignment with the rest of the country on that. We have asked for new language to make it a real felony to threaten to shoot up a school. You live in a state where the penalties for making a mass threat against a school, petty misdemeanor. That's not right. That doesn't make any sense. So there's gun-related legislation, there's legislation pertaining to the statute of limitations, the penalties for murder, and then beyond and behind all of this is a general call for the legislature to make the kinds of investments that I was talking to President Stokes about. We're going to be going into a legislative session with a huge surplus. And this legislature, to its credit, has demonstrated a willingness to make investments in children. What I would ask them to do is to make a special commitment to making investments in the highest risk slice of that demographic, those kids in custody, those kids who are suffering from adverse childhood experiences. We can do so much better by those children. And right now, if I send somebody's parent to prison, do you know what happens when they go back to APS the next day? Nothing. I just go back to class. Don't you think if we want to make sure that that child doesn't follow their dad to prison, that we should do something focused on that child? I think we have an ethical obligation to do it. And I can tell you what, we no longer have the financial excuse not to do it. So that's something I think we should do.
Thank you. Thanks, Raul. Other questions? Tom? Jenkins? Tom, excuse my interrupt. Could you use the mic? We are virtually producing this as well. So we want our listeners from wherever they're listening in to hear.
Yes, Raúl, are the courts continuing to pull back on your ability to indict people?
So this has been a long running debate between my office and the judiciary. 10 years ago, this jurisdiction used to have between 6,000 and 7,000 indictments a year. And we would have a grand jury impaneled 4 days a week, virtually every week, all year long. My office now has access to 2.5 days worth of grand jury a month. And even though it went down to 0 during the pandemic, it is only now being slightly turned back on. The reason that that's so important from a resource standpoint is this. If Chief Medina, one of his officers, brings me a case for, let's say, a stolen vehicle, I can schedule a grand jury at 10:15. It will be one officer. I won't have to bring the victim in. And all we have to do is make a basic probable cause presentation to indict that individual and move the case forward. When I have to take that same case to preliminary hearing, I have to call not only the primary officer, I have to call every officer who was involved. I have to have the victim there. I have to have the defendant there. And if anybody doesn't show up, that hearing is vacated. It doesn't happen. Right now, we have a failure rate of about 2/3 of our preliminary hearings fail because one or more of those participants won't show up. That's the biggest resource impact that we have. We have asked repeatedly, Chief Medina has now asked repeatedly for the grand jury to be turned back on because we are, based on past calculations, missing about 2,500 or 2,600 felony cases from the last year. Unlaunched, totally unlaunched cases. You know what the number one reason for not being able to proceed for a preliminary hearing? The defendant doesn't show up. And think about that from the perspective of a victim. Someone stole your car, they got arrested. They're out, they're not detained because of all the reasons that we just talked about. We set a date out 45 days and you're a working person, maybe you have kids. And we call you, maybe we call you several times and you say, I'm working. I have kids, I have childcare, I have all these issues. Okay, I'll go. So you take time off work, you get childcare, you get somebody to drive you down to the courthouse because maybe you still don't have your car back. You go down there and you wait. And now we're doing it virtually, so it's a little less impactful. And all the officers show up. Let me say that again. All the officers show up, people working graveyard, people that are overstretched by all the requirements that we put on APD, but they're all there. The defendant doesn't show up. So the judge says, thank you all for being here today. We're going to issue a bench warrant. We walk out into the hallway with the victim and she says, what happened? And we say, well, he wasn't here. We couldn't move forward with the preliminary hearing. And she says, what next? And we say, when and if we run into this person, he'll get arrested. And when he gets arrested, we will have then 10 days to restart this process again. Not 45 days. We don't get to give you advance notice. We give you 10 days. Really? Okay. So we do that. We get that process in place. Somehow she lucks out. She comes back down to the courthouse. She's there. The defendant's there because he's in custody. Officer number 1's there. Officer number 2 is on military leave. But anything he would say that would be admissible in the grand jury, that's hearsay in a preliminary hearing. So officer 2's not there, case dismissed. And the dismissal that accompanies that dismissal says state not ready to proceed. And then it just goes back into a pile, could be relaunched. That's what eliminating the grand jury has done in this jurisdiction. And it is having massive, massive resource impacts on the police department and the district attorney's office. So to the extent you have friends in the judiciary and you're striking up a conversation, which I'm sure many of you do, you're just talking to your judge friends about, hey, let's talk about the grand jury. But if you ever find yourself in that position, please have the conversation because it has real life, real world impacts on our institution and on his institution and what we were able to do and provide for victims. And by the way, don't let anybody fool you and say, oh, we're going to be railroading people and we're not going to be able to process this. All we're talking about doing is initiating, launching a case. We're still going to have pretrial discovery. We're still going to have pretrial interviews. We're still going to have motions. We have to have a trial. We have to do all of that. This is simply a matter of getting a case off the ground.
Thank you, Raúl. So we don't have time for any more questions. We could go on and on, but we do need to try to stay to our schedule. So, Raúl, we just appreciate you so much. Day in, day out, you work at the very, very hard task of keeping violent people off our streets. So thank you. You also have the courage to work at trying to divert those people who need help and get them help. And that is a very big task. And we appreciate it so very much. So if everyone can show Raúl some appreciation, thank you. All right, it's now my privilege to bring Chris Duncanson to the stage. Chris is Vice President at Comcast. He's a leader for the Leadership Albuquerque program and on our board of directors. So he's very involved in all of our policy work. And Chris has a few closing comments to make. Chris, thank you.
Thank you, Terri. Thank you, DA Torrez. As we conclude today, I'd like to just say that it does not have to be a defining feature of our community. We can and we must make our city and state a difficult place to be a criminal. We need to keep getting better and smarter, and those who are driving the lion's share of our crime need to face quick and clear consequences. Driving down crime is possible, and I'm proud that our business community and our chamber in particular is prioritizing public safety as the economic development priority that it is. We need the next decade to be a decade of growth, and reducing the risk and cost of crime is necessary for that growth to occur. Okay, on behalf of the chamber, allow me to once again thank today's event sponsor, PNM, UNM, New Mexico Mutual, French Funerals and Cremations, UNIRAC, Western Sky Community Care, Comcast, Ultra Health, Albertsons, Verizon, Bank of Albuquerque, Fidelity, Moles and Corbin, Newsenda, General Mills, Payday HCM, Janes, US Bank, Sandia Laboratory Federal Credit Union, KOB4, Giltmore LLC, and Loveless Biomedical. You can tell by the number of sponsors that this is an issue that's important to our community. Our next event is a virtual one, the second event in our Business Beat speaker series, and it will feature LFC Director David Abbey on December 8th at 3 p.m. If you want to know the very latest on the state's fiscal position and receive a preview of the 2022 legislative session, then you'll want to make sure you log in for this event. This concludes our fourth annual CrimeSTAT briefing. It's been our pleasure to have you here for today's event. Be safe and we'll see you soon. Thank you for being here.